Out of the many Why No One Plays videos I've made across my 3 channels over the past 4 years, the most compelling ones feature characters whose poor representation was less a result of their own strength and more the surrounding circumstances that led up to players either discarding them or not giving them a chance in the first place. While there have been prior instances of this, I find Yanqing's story to be particularly unfortunate as he had the makings of an incredibly strong character, but it's as if the universe itself was against him from both a practical and design standpoint. In contrast to Genshin's more conservative beginning, Honkai Star Rail broke into a full sprint right from the get-go, releasing new content very frequently and corresponding units that can handle the game's mounting endgame difficulty, leading to a very rapid meta progression with it feeling like every new unit had something interesting to offer. This has resulted in a very eventful version 1 to say the least, but a consequence of this is that anyone who couldn't keep up with the breakneck pace of Star Rail was quickly discarded, which we've observed for many Day 1 characters, and I would say Yanqing was by far the most affected. In today's episode of Why No One Plays, we'll be looking at all the factors and elements responsible for Yanqing's failure to launch, along with discussing if there's any possibility for him to find meaningful success in the future. If there's one thing I enjoy about Honkai Star Rail, it's that they actually release new and varied endgame content. Without beating a dead horse on the matter, one of the main benefits of new content is that it can retroactively increase the value of existing characters by presenting new scenarios that incentivize other mechanics, as evidenced by how Pure Fiction skyrocketed Himiko, Herta, and Serval from near unviable to a borderline must-have. If it were just Memory of Chaos and Swarm Disaster, they would have stayed irrelevant for the rest of their days. So it's not that they were bad units, or at least not entirely, it's that they just needed the right scenario to exercise their strengths. And I think Yanqing is facing a similar situation, although his is, putting it bluntly, far more troublesome. Yanqing is the greatest victim of circumstance out of any character in Aegis Arc period, with some considering that next to Physical Trailblazer, he might be the worst 5-star in the game, the Chi-Chi of Star Rail. Absurd to think about when you consider how good he can be in theory. For the uninitiated, the basic premise of Yanqing's playstyle is that he can output immense damage to a single target under the sole condition that he never takes damage. His talent provides huge bonuses to his crit stats, a chance to follow-up attack whenever he strikes an enemy, effectively multiplying his DPS, and a chance to freeze enemies which deals additional damage based on his attack. So long as he never sustains damage, you can potentially have this effect up for the entire fight through his skill, an incredible power boost to have theoretically limitless access to, which is virtually impossible to pull off in Star Rail's turn-based environment, at least with the current units that we have. Ironically, Yanqing would be an extremely powerful character if this was Genshin, where you can avoid enemy attacks either by dodging out of the way or abusing iframes on elemental burst animations, not to mention the overwhelming abundance of shield users at your disposal and other practices like swapping out to a different character, only coming out to attack when the enemy is staggered or vulnerable. In Star Rail, however, trying to protect Yanqing from sustaining damage is much more onerous. In regards to shields, the only unit who can consistently maintain a shield big enough to last until it can be refreshed is Gepard. And to his credit, with enough investment, Gepard is more than capable of doing so. But that poses a problem in and of itself. It's not uncommon for characters to synergize well with each other. Seele and Bronya, aside from being one of the most shipped pairs in all across the Honkai universe, are practically meant for each other in-game. But in Seele's defense, she can function just fine without Bronya and vice versa. There's a major difference between having a support as an ideal pair and having a support as a crutch. Yanqing's dependence on Gepard is not out of convenience, but necessity. Because of how inevitable taking damage is in Star Rail, Yanqing will almost always lose his attack buff, as even a stray hit will knock him right out of it. For example, if the enemy applies a dot effect on him, or if the enemy has a party-wide attack, even if Yanqing takes only 1 damage, that's enough for him to lose this buff. It's an extremely tight stipulation. In my opinion, it would have been more comfortable if, to maintain his buff, he had to be above half HP, so that a small gust of wind wouldn't kill all of his DPS. But Hoyo isn't known for retroactively buffing characters, so he can't sit and wait for something like that to happen. That's the first and foremost problem with Yanqing. He's crucially dependent on shields and only shields to be able to function. For all intents and purposes, you have to treat him like he has only 1 HP. This automatically renders most of the game's best defensive supports incompatible with him. Healers like Locha and Huohuo might be able to keep him alive and healthy, but they can't do anything to prevent him from losing his passive. Same goes for Fu Xuan, who can only redirect a portion of all damage taken, meaning Yanqing still takes damage. So while she's easily the best tank in the game, the fact that she doesn't outright stop her team from getting hurt is what makes her incompatible with him. This leaves you with only Gepard as an optimal defensive support for him. The other alternative for shields is March, and she doesn't have adequate numbers to permashield Yanqing. Even if she did, there's another issue with that which I'll talk about in just a moment. Back to Gepard though, This already poses a logistical challenge, since Genshin and Star Rail don't allow unrestricted free-to-play access to all playable characters compared to League or Smash. A frequent comment I get in my Why No One Plays videos, which I know is mostly as a joke or for fun, but it's worth pointing out, is no one plays them because no one has them. I try not to use that as a main point because that's kind of a cop-out and would make for a boring video, but I might have to make an exception for Yanqing, as in his case, it legitimately is because hardly anyone has him. Or rather, hardly anyone has him and Japard. There are probably many players in Star Rail who do have Yanqing, likely accidentally they're losing a 50-50 or if for some reason you burned your unit selector on him, but the number of people with both him and Japard is measurably low. See, in light of the 300 pulse unit selector, the lack of an event banner for standard units is not a problem in Star Rail. Yanqing is disqualified from that by needing to get 2, and with the game being out for less than a year, there hasn't been enough time for players to acquire all standard 5 stars just by playing the game. For Genshin, which has been out for 3 years, I think it's safe to assume that day 1 players have at least one copy of Diluc, Jean, Mona, Qiqi, and Koqing. It's gonna take a while before day 1 players get one of every Star Rail standard 5 star, so at the moment, that is a big reason why Yanqing has such poor representation. But let's cut him some slack and try to use him without Japard. While it's very easy for Yanqing to lose his talent buff in combat, it's somewhat compensated by having an easy way to reactivate it, as mentioned before with his skill. But that's where we arrive at the second problem with him. Next to Lunai, Danheng, and Qingce, Yanqing is one of the most SP demanding carries in the game. His skill is the only way to activate his talent, and it only lasts to the turn in which he activates it and the following, requiring you to use his skill every other turn at minimum to make the most of his DPS. Hunt characters in particular can be especially SP hungry, but at least to the likes of Seela and Topaz, there are turns where they can use their normal basic attack and still do good damage as they can usually access their buff through other means. Seela can acquire Resurgence just by taking down an enemy. Topaz can use basics to advance Nabi forward and only use his skill to redirect him. Yanqing, however, is forced to use his skill virtually every time. This is why March is not viable with Yanqing, as you'd be burning the candle on both ends using their skills combined. You might say, then what is the point of having to bring along a shield user if he has to refresh his buff anyway? That's due to his ultimate, a 60% crit boost followed by a massive burst of damage to a single enemy. He also gets 50% bonus crit damage for the next turn if the buff is active. With ultimates being quick play spells, it's imperative that Yanqing has his passive at all times, since you might use his burst on the opponent's turn. It would suck for you to use his skill, get buffed, then take damage right as your ultimate comes up, forcing you to wait until his turn comes back up and use his skill again, which is energy and SP you're wasting. Speaking of his ultimate, that's another downside to the whole condition of never getting hit. In Star Rail, you charge your ultimate by dealing and taking damage. Since optimal play on Yanqing necessitates never getting hit, you can only charge your ultimate through attacks and supports like Tingyun. Obviously, you don't want your main carry to be face tanking enemy hits, but on many occasions you might have to, just to get that last bit of energy to use their ultimate. All the more reason why Japard is the only one who can efficiently protect Yanqing, as he can let him charge his ultimate through getting hit without dispelling the passive, and with the 140 ultimate cost, he needs every bit he can get. In any case, this is where Yanqing's power comes from. When combining his ultimate and talent together, he gets 80% crit rate and crit damage for free, which is incredible. But the requirements to pull this off consistently are too cumbersome for the majority of players, especially when considering how even at his best, he barely holds up against other carries. The advantage of a Hun unit is their comparably higher speed and rate of action. Units like Seela can turn refresh, Topaz can advance Nabi's action forward to strike faster, things of that nature. Yanqing has none of this. He gets 10% bonus speed when achieving a critical hit, but that's nothing compared to turn advances because it essentially prevents him from having a modicum of AoE clearing. He can only work against a single target. Even for Dr. Ratio, who also performs best against isolated targets, his fall of attack's ability to strike a different target if the first one dies means he can handle the occasional mook that spawns every now and then. No such luck for Yanqing. Exacerbating this is how much easier it is for units to overlap with each other given Star Rail's turn-based combat. In Genshin, you can reasonably argue that Hu Tao, Diluc, Yoimiya, and Lini, despite all being pyro on-field attackers, have their own incentives to be played due to the game's more open-ended real-time combat. Playstyles have a big role in distinguishing members of the same element. If you like to fight from afar or up close, if you want to swing a big sword or play someone who hits hard and fast, etc. There is no playstyle in Honkai Star Rail, it's just pressing either E, Q, or 1, 2, 3, 4 and having the cutscenes play out. Subsequently, the more limited range of actions in turn-based combat means it's easier for units to be compared to one another directly. It's all about numbers and specs, making things all the more painful for Yanqing as there just so happens to be another Ice Element DPS 5-star. Jingliu. I'll cut right to the point. Jingliu is infinitely better than Yanqing. Lately, I've been trying to avoid hard statements like X character is better than Y because there's always someone playing the whataboutism game in the comments, but I don't think anyone's gonna disagree with this statement. Take every single problem Yanqing has. Poor uptime, high SP cost, ridiculously unforgiving passive buff condition, lack of any semblance of AoE, high ultimate cost for someone who can't afford to get hit, low accessibility due to being a standard banner unit, and critical dependence on a singular support character also with low accessibility. Throw them all out the window and give them even more damage. That's Jingliu. Jingliu's talent is basically Yanqing's talent, but better in every conceivable way. Not only does it give her a staggering 50% crit boost and refreshes her turn immediately upon activation, but she can maintain this state so long as she has a stack of Syzygy, of which you can have up to 3 of, and her talent and ultimate can also give you an additional stack as well as her empowered skill not consuming SP. In addition to that, she does blast damage, letting her deal big damage to her primary enemy while still clearing mooks. She can do all of this by herself, meaning the rest of your party can be whoever the hell you want. You can bring any healer, any shielder, any buffer, any debuffer. There is nothing hamstringing her usability whatsoever. She's essentially the DLC version of Yanqing. Like if Yanqing is Blue Eye's Ultimate Dragon, Jingliu is Blue Eye's alternative Ultimate Dragon. There's quite literally no reason to invest in Yanqing if you have Jingliu. Honestly, they don't even have to be an ice unit. Elements in this game are of less importance than in Genshin in that there are no elemental reactions or things like that. The only important thing with elements is whether it breaks toughness gauges on the opponent, and even then Silverwolf can artificially implant any weakness you want, or you can simply use the other weaknesses on the enemy. So Yanqing isn't just competing with Jingliu, he's competing with Seele, Ratio, Lunai, Danheng, Blade, Kafka, Jingyuan, Qingque, basically everyone else in the game, and just about all of them can do equal or more damage than he can, especially for far less investment. The downside of being a standard banner unit is that unless you get lucky, or should I say unlucky, you're not going to get those units until later on in your gameplay. Let's say you're a day 1 player and you pull Seele and Blade, 2 respectable DPS units. You gear them up and use them throughout your playthrough, and then a few months later you get Yanqing. If Yanqing was your first DPS unit, there might have been a reason for you to want to use him, specifically since all those free stats make him godly in the early game. But if you already have other units geared up, he looks pretty bad in comparison. Like I said in the beginning, Star Rail broke into a full sprint with his characters, releasing banger after banger. In version 1.0, Yanqing was average at best, so come 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, when you have these demons breaking everything in half, if you pull for Yanqing in 1.5 or 1.6, there's legitimately no reason to even level him up since the game is way past that point. Where I'm getting at is that Yanqing never had a chance to make a good impression. In contrast, a version 1 character like Diluc had a special place in people's hearts given he was pretty strong for a fairly long time, throughout most of version 1 and even for a while after Hu Tao came out. So while he eventually got Powercrept come version 2 onwards, players made good use of him during the first year of Genshin, but Yanqing was made obsolete practically on release. Like in version 1.0, he was Powercrept already because we had Seele as the first featured 5-star banner, and despite being different elements, she was by all accounts a league ahead of him, and every hyper carry unit that came after, Jingliu, Ratio, and Lunai Danheng, were all measured against Seele. Yanqing was just dealt a really bad hand. It's a shame too because he's one of the more interesting side characters in Star Rail, being the protege of Jingyuan and his brief encounter with Jingliu. And lest you forget, everyone gushes about him in the story about how talented he is, once in a generation, a born genius and all that, the youngest to ever be in his position. It's really disappointing to see him written off as the worst 5-star in the game when he never had a chance to shine in the first place. The only way I can see him finding a resurgence is if they straight up buff him. He's too generic of a damage dealer unlike Himiko and Herta that even if they release new single target oriented content, he'll forever be stuck behind the other hunt and destruction characters since any support that can help him can also help them. Let's say they release a new shield unit that can also buff and do other things more than Japart. What's to stop that same shield unit from being used for Jingliu or Seele rather than Yanqing? There isn't anything in his moveset that sets him apart from other characters enough to where certain supports will benefit him more than his competition. So what do you guys think? Do you think I'm being too harsh with him or do you agree with my points? Feel free to share it in the comments. That's gonna be it for today, so if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you'd like to like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other Honkai Star Rail Why No One Plays videos if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.